There are crimes so incomprehensible that the human mind struggles to process them, acts so horrifying that communities choose collective amnesia over remembrance. This is the story of one such event. Welcome to this journey through one of the most devastating tragedies in rural American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will challenge everything you believe about family, desperation, and the darkest corners of the human psyche in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a case that shocked even hardened investigators in the depths of the Great Depression, where a mother and father made a decision so unthinkable that newspapers across the nation struggled to find words adequate to describe their actions. They left a legacy so disturbing that the community where it happened erected no memorial, held no vigil, and spoke the family's name only in whispers for generations afterward. It was the year 1932. The Great Depression was suffocating the United States, grinding down even the strongest families with relentless poverty. Banks had collapsed, farms were foreclosed, bread lines stretched around city blocks while crops rotted in fields because nobody could afford to buy them. President Herbert Hoover insisted prosperity was just around the corner, but for millions of Americans, that corner seemed to retreat further with each passing day. In rural Appalachian, Kentucky, in the remote reaches of Harlan County, the situation was worse than almost anywhere else in America. This was coal country, where men descended into the earth each day, risking their lives for wages that barely kept their children fed. But by 1932, even those meager jobs had largely disappeared. Mine after mine had shut down. Company stores extended credit until families owed more than they could ever repay. Evictions were commonplace. Starvation was real. The mountains of eastern Kentucky had always been unforgiving, steep ridges covered in dense forest, narrow valleys where creeks ran cold and fast, communities scattered along winding dirt roads that became impassable rivers of mud during spring rains. The land was beautiful in its severity, ancient mountains worn smooth by time, their peaks shrouded in morning mist, their hollows dark and secret even at midday. Here, people lived by different rules than those in cities, or even in the flatter farmlands of the Midwest. Extended families clustered together in ramshackle cabins, sharing what little they had. Religion ran deep. Pentecostal churches and Baptist congregations where worship was fervent, emotional, absolute. The Bible wasn't just read, it was lived, its words taken literally, its promises clung to with desperate faith. And here, in a hollow so remote it had no official name, locals simply called it Cutter's Creek after the family that had lived there longest. Something happened that would haunt the region for decades. The cabin stood at the end of a rutted path, barely visible from the main road. It was a simple structure, rough, hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a tin roof that leaked in a dozen places, a stone chimney that leaned slightly to one side. No electricity, no running water, an outhouse behind the building, its door hanging crooked on leather hinges. A small garden plot, mostly barren by late autumn, a chicken coop with no chickens. Inside this cabin lived the Brennan family. James Brennan was 30, 8 years old, though he looked a decade older. Years in the coal mines had bent his back and filled his lungs with black dust. When he coughed, which was often, it sounded like stones grinding together deep in his chest. He'd lost his job at the mine in 1930, and since then he'd found only occasional day labor. His hands, once strong enough to swing a pickaxe for 12 hours straight, now trembled when he tried to hold a cup of coffee. His wife, Sarah Brennan, was 34. She'd been pretty once, with auburn hair and clear blue eyes. But poverty and childbearing had worn her down. 7 pregnancies in 12 years. 4 children survived. Her teeth were going bad. Her hands were rough and cracked from hauling water and scrubbing clothes on a washboard. She sang hymns while she worked, her voice thin but true, floating through the hollow like a prayer. The children, Martha was 11, a serious girl with her mother's eyes. She helped with the younger ones, took on responsibilities no child should bear. She could cook a basic meal, change a diaper, rock a crying baby to sleep. When she smiled, which was rare, her whole face transformed, revealing the child she might have been in a different world. Thomas was 9, small for his age, perpetually hungry. He collected kindling for the fire, drew water from the creek, set snares for rabbits that rarely produced anything. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's solemn disposition. The twins, Jacob and Rebecca, were 5 years old. They'd been born in the winter of 1927, during a blizzard that had trapped the family in their cabin for 3 days. Sarah had labored alone except for James and young Martha, who even at 6 years old had shown remarkable calm during the ordeal. The twins had arrived small and frail, but they'd survived against the odds. They still shared that mysterious connection people say twins possess, finishing each other's sentences, crying when the other was hurt, sleeping curled together like puppies. This was the Brennan family in the autumn of 1932, hungry, desperate, faithful, and about to make a choice that would echo through eternity. November came to the mountains with bitter cold. Frost appeared on the ground each morning, crystalline and beautiful and deadly to what little vegetation remained. The leaves had fallen from the trees, leaving the forest skeletal, exposed. When wind moved through the hollow, it sounded like voices distant, mournful, prophetic. The Brennan family was starving, not the metaphorical hunger of missing a meal, but real starvation. The kind that makes children's bellies swell, that causes hair to fall out in clumps, that turns skin sallow and makes bones visible through flesh. They'd eaten the last of their stored potatoes 2 weeks earlier. The beans were gone. The small amount of cornmeal had been stretched into increasingly thin portions until it was simply gone. James had walked to town a 6-mile journey each way looking for work, any work. He'd offered to muck out stables, chop wood, repair fences, anything. But everyone was in the same situation. Nobody had money to hire help. The general store extended no more credit. The church had a food pantry, but it had been emptied weeks ago, and donations had stopped coming because everyone who might donate was themselves in need. He returned home as the sun was setting, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. Sarah asked no questions. She'd seen his empty hands. Martha had heated water over the fire. Just water, nothing to flavor it, no vegetables to make soup, no bone to add substance. They each drank a cup of hot water and pretended it filled their stomachs. That night, the twins cried with hunger. Their small bodies couldn't understand why the pain wouldn't stop. Rebecca developed a cough that worried Sarah. Jacob's skin felt hot to the touch. They needed food. They needed medicine. They needed warmth. They had none of it. James and Sarah lay awake in their narrow bed, listening to their children's suffering. The cabin's single room meant there was no escape from the sounds. Martha trying to comfort the twins, Thomas whimpering in his sleep, the wind pushing through gaps in the walls. The fire dying to embers because they needed to conserve what little wood they had. "They're going to die," Sarah whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the flat certainty of someone who'd watched death claim too many in these mountains. Infants who never learned to walk, mothers who bled out during childbirth, men crushed in mine collapses. The old, and the sick during harsh winters. Death was a familiar presence here. "We'll find a way," James said, but his voice carried no conviction. "What way? Tell me what way?" He had no answer. The next morning, James went hunting. He took his grandfather's rifle, the one valuable possession the family still owned. He had 3 bullets, 3 chances to bring back meat that might keep them alive a few more days. He disappeared into the forest as dawn broke, moving through the bare trees like a ghost, desperate and determined. He returned at dusk, empty-handed. He'd seen a deer, a young buck, had drawn a careful bead on it, but when he pulled the trigger, the shot went wide. Maybe his hands shook too badly. Maybe hunger had affected his vision. Maybe God had intervened. The deer had bounded away, white tail flashing, and James had sunk to his knees in the fallen leaves and wept. 2 bullets remained. Sarah said nothing when he returned. She was sitting by the fire, the children arranged around her. Martha had found some wild onions, and they'd boiled them in water to make a thin broth. Everyone got 3 spoonfuls. It did nothing to ease the hunger, but at least it was something warm in their stomachs. That night, Sarah had a dream. She would later describe it in detail to the authorities, and her description would chill everyone who heard it. In the dream, she stood in a field of golden wheat, endless and abundant. The sun was warm on her face. She could hear her children laughing, not the weak, pitiful sounds they made now, but genuine joy, bubbling up from healthy lungs and happy hearts. She walked through the wheat, searching for them, and the stalks parted before her like a curtain. She found them in a clearing. All 4 children, dressed in white, their faces glowing with health. They were playing some game she couldn't quite understand, their movements synchronized, graceful. When they saw her, they smiled, and those smiles held no trace of suffering. "Mama," Martha called. "Come and be with us." "I can't," Sarah said. "I don't know how to reach you." "Rebecca." Little Rebecca, with her dark curls and solemn eyes, walked forward. She took Sarah's hand. Her touch was warm, solid, real. "Through the fire, Mama. That's the only way. Through the fire." Sarah woke with a gasp, her heart pounding. The cabin was dark, except for the dying embers in the fireplace. She could hear James's labored breathing beside her. She could hear the children shifting in their sleep. And she could hear something else, a voice, clear as a bell, though whether it came from inside her head or from somewhere beyond, she couldn't say. "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." The words from the Gospel of Matthew. Words she'd heard preached 100 times. Words that had always meant something simple and beautiful. That Jesus loved children, welcomed them, blessed them. But now, in the darkness, starving and desperate, those words took on a different meaning, a terrible meaning. The next 3 days passed in a haze of hunger and cold. The twins grew weaker. Rebecca's cough worsened, wet and rattling. Jacob's fever climbed higher. Martha and Thomas moved slowly, conserving energy, their eyes too large in their thinning faces. Sarah couldn't shake the dream. It repeated itself each night, with minor variations, but always the same essential message. Through the fire, that's the only way. She began to wonder if it truly was a message, not from her own desperate mind, but from God Himself. She read her Bible constantly, the only book the family owned, its pages worn soft from handling, its margins filled with notes from previous owners. She turned again and again to passages about sacrifice, about Abraham preparing to kill Isaac before God stayed his hand, about how God Himself had sacrificed His own Son for the salvation of mankind, about the valley of Hinnom where, in ancient times, the unfaithful had passed their children through fire to false gods. But what if it wasn't to a false god? What if the fire was the gateway to salvation? The idea was insane. She knew that. Part of her mind screamed against it, horrified, rejecting the very thought. But another part, the part that watched her children suffering, the part that knew they faced a slow, painful death from starvation or disease, that part whispered that maybe, there was a terrible mercy in what the dream suggested. On the third day after the dream, James went to town again. This time he took the rifle to sell. It would bring a few dollars, enough for a small bag of flour, maybe some beans. It was their last asset. After this, there was nothing left. He returned 6 hours later, his face set in a mask of despair. The rifle had brought less than he'd hoped, $2. The storekeeper had driven a hard bargain, knowing James was desperate. With the money, James had bought 10 pounds of flour and a small tin of lard. It would feed them for perhaps a week if they were very careful. And then what? That night, Sarah told James about the dream. She spoke quietly, carefully, watching his face in the firelight. She expected shock, rejection, horror. Instead, she saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition, perhaps. Or consideration. "I've been praying," he said finally, asking God what to do, begging him for guidance. "And I keep thinking about Job, how God tested him, took away everything he loved to prove his faith." Sarah's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying." James's voice broke. He swallowed hard, tried again. "I'm saying that maybe God is testing us, testing whether we love him more than we love even our own children, testing whether we trust him enough to believe that what seems like death is actually deliverance." They sat in silence for a long time. The children slept, unaware of the conversation that would determine their fate. The fire crackled. Wind moaned around the cabin's corners. "We can't," Sarah whispered. "James, we can't. They're dying anyway. You know it. I know it. We've seen enough people starve to know what comes next. The pain, the slow fading. Rebecca might not last another week. The fever's taking Jacob. But to do it ourselves, to deliver them swiftly to God's arms instead of watching them suffer for days or weeks. Is that not mercy? Is that not love? James's voice was rising now, taking on the cadence of the preachers they'd heard at revival meetings. God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham was willing because he had faith, because he believed God's promise, and God rewarded that faith. God stopped Abraham's hand. Yes, and maybe he'll stop ours, but we have to show we're willing. We have to demonstrate that level of faith. Sarah felt something breaking inside her. The last defenses of sanity, perhaps, or maybe the chains of earthly thinking that prevented true spiritual understanding. She didn't know anymore. She knew only that her children were suffering, that there was no hope of rescue, that death was coming for them one way or another. Through the fire, she heard herself say, the dream said through the fire. James nodded slowly. His eyes were bright with tears, but also with something else. Conviction, certainty, the look of a man who'd made a decision, no matter how terrible. "It has to be both of us," he said. "We bear this burden together. We face God's judgment together." Over the next 2 days, they prepared. The word itself seems obscene, preparing to murder one's own children. But they approached it with the solemnity of ritual, convincing themselves through prayer and scripture reading that they were doing God's will. They fasted, eating nothing, giving their meager food to the children. They prayed constantly, asking for a sign, hoping for intervention, pleading for the dream to be wrong. No sign came. No angel appeared with a ram caught in the thicket. No voice from heaven commanded them to stop. Martha noticed the change in her parents. "Mama, are you sick?" She asked. "No, baby, we're just praying hard for deliverance. Will God answer?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathed in the scent of her hair, unwashed but still sweet, still precious. "Yes," she whispered, "one way or another he'll answer. They chose Sunday, the Lord's day. They would perform the sacrifice because that's how they thought of it now, not as murder but as sacrifice. In the morning, when the sun rose over the mountains and light filled the hollow." Saturday night, James went out and gathered wood. More wood than needed for cooking or heating. He stacked it carefully in the cabin's center, creating a structure. A pyre. Martha watched him work. "Papa, why are you building that?" "We're going to have a special prayer service tomorrow, a fire to send our prayers up to heaven. Can I help?" James's hands stilled. He looked at his eldest daughter, serious, responsible Martha, who'd been forced to grow up too fast, who'd helped birth her own siblings, who'd comforted them through sickness and hunger, who trusted him absolutely. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible, "you can help." That night none of them slept. Sarah held the twins, memorizing the weight of them, the warmth. James sat with Thomas, teaching him one last hymn. Martha cleaned the cabin, as if tidiness mattered, as if God would judge them more favorably if the floor was swept. As dawn approached, gray light seeping through the cabin's cracks, James lit the pyre. The wood caught quickly, flames climbing, heat building. The children watched with interest, not fear. Fire was a normal part of life, a source of warmth and light. They had no reason to be afraid. "Children," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady, "come here, we're going to pray together, a special prayer." They gathered around her. All four of them, trusting and innocent. She could feel James behind her, supporting her, both of them locked in this terrible shared delusion. She began to sing, "Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world." The children joined in, their voices sweet and clear. James stepped forward. In his hand he held a length of rope. What happened next would haunt Harlan County for generations. But the full horror of that morning was prevented by an intervention that James and Sarah Brennan never anticipated. Reverend Thomas McKay had been uneasy all week. The pastor of the small Baptist church that served the scattered families in that region, he knew his flock intimately. He knew which families were struggling most. He knew the Brennans had reached a point of desperation that frightened him. He'd tried to visit them twice during the previous week, but the roads had been too muddy, and he'd turned back. But Saturday night he couldn't sleep. He woke repeatedly, feeling a crushing sense of urgency he couldn't explain. His wife found him at 3 in the morning, sitting at their kitchen table, head in his hands. "Thomas, what's wrong?" "I need to check on the Brennans." "At this hour? The roads." "Something's wrong. I can feel it." He left before dawn, riding his horse up the treacherous path to Cutter's Creek. The sun was just rising when he reached the cabin. He saw smoke rising from the chimney, far too much smoke for a normal cooking fire. He heard singing, and something in that singing, a desperation, a finality, made him leap from his horse and run. He burst through the door without knocking. The scene that confronted him would appear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The massive fire burning in the cabin's center. James Brennan holding rope, approaching his children. Sarah with her arms around all four of them, her face ecstatic and terrible. The children's confusion beginning to shift toward fear as they sensed something wrong. "Stop!" Reverend McKay's voice filled the cabin like a thunderclap. "In God's name, stop!" James spun around, the rope falling from his hands. For a moment the spell broke. The religious fervor that had sustained them cracked, and reality came flooding back. James looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. He looked at his children, at the fire, at what he'd been about to do. He collapsed to his knees, a wail of anguish tearing from his throat. The sound was inhuman, the cry of a man confronting the enormity of his intended act. Sarah didn't move. She held the children tighter. "No," she said. "No, you don't understand. We have to save them, through the fire. It's the only way. Sarah." Reverend Mackay moved slowly toward her, hands outstretched. "Sarah, this isn't God's will. This is desperation and hunger and suffering speaking, but it's not God. The dream was a dream, just a dream. God doesn't ask his children to murder their babies. Abraham. God stopped Abraham. He stopped him, Sarah, because it was only ever a test of faith, not an actual command to kill. The point was that Abraham was willing, not that he should follow through." Martha began to cry. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she understood enough. Thomas was shaking. The twins were silent. Why? Died, sensing the terrible tension. Reverend Mackay reached out and gently took Rebekah from Sarah's arms. "Then Jacob, let them go," he said softly. "Let them come to me." Sarah's arms fell away. The strength that had sustained her evaporated. She crumpled, sobbing, her hands covering her face. "We were starving. They were dying. I couldn't watch them suffer anymore. I know, but this isn't the answer. This is never the answer." James was still on his knees, rocking back and forth, moaning. Martha went to him and wrapped her thin arms around his neck. "Papa," she whispered. "It's okay, Papa." Reverend Mackay acted quickly. He doused the fire, filled his arms with the younger children, and told Martha and Thomas to follow him. "We're going to the church, right now, all of you." "What about Mama and Papa?" Martha asked. "They're coming too. Everyone's coming." He loaded them all onto his horse and cart, a tight fit, but possible. The children huddled together, confused and frightened but alive. James and Sarah sat like statues, the full horror of what they'd nearly done washing over them in waves. By the time they reached town, word had spread. Reverend Mackay had stopped at the first farm they passed and sent word to the sheriff. A small crowd had gathered at the church, curious, concerned, horrified as they heard fragments of what had almost occurred. Sheriff Burton Hollis was a practical man. 45 years old, he'd seen the effects of the Depression up close. He'd witnessed desperation drive people to theft, violence, even suicide. But this was beyond anything in his experience. He found the Brennan family in the church basement. The children were eating soup the church ladies had quickly prepared, their hunger making them oblivious to the tension around them. James and Sarah sat apart, not speaking, not touching, trapped in their own private hells. "Reverend Mackay tells me we had a close call this morning," Sheriff Hollis said carefully. James looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "I was going to kill my children," he said flatly. "We both were. We were going to bind them and put them in the fire." The room went silent. The church ladies stopped their bustling. Everyone stared. "We thought," Sarah's voice broke, "we thought it was God's will, that we were saving them from suffering, sending them straight to heaven before the starvation could take them." Sheriff Hollis had to make a decision. By law, attempted murder was attempted murder. The fact that the attempt hadn't been carried out didn't erase the intent. The fact that the would-be victims were the perpetrator's own children made it worse, not better. He should arrest them immediately. But as he looked at the Brennan family, the skeletal children, the desperate parents who were themselves starving, he saw the bigger crime. The crime of a society that had allowed its citizens to reach this point of desperation. The crime of economic policies that had crushed the poorest and most vulnerable. The crime of a community that had, despite its good intentions, failed to recognize the depth of one family's suffering. "Here's what's going to happen," he said slowly. "The children are staying here at the church. The ladies will feed them and care for them while we sort this out. You too. He looked at James and Sarah. Are coming to the jail, not as prisoners yet, but for your own safety and for theirs. We need to decide what's to be done. Are we going to hang? James asked. I don't know, Sheriff Hollis said honestly. I genuinely don't know. The legal proceedings that followed were unlike anything Harlan County had seen. The case became known simply as the Brennan matter, spoken of in hushed tones. Newspapers across Kentucky picked up the story, and then national papers. The headlines were sensational. Parents plan to burn children alive. Great Depression drives family to attempted murder. Poverty's ultimate toll, when starvation makes monsters. But as details emerged, the narrative became more complex. This wasn't a case of evil people doing evil things. It was a case of desperate people, driven to the edge of sanity by circumstances beyond their control, who'd convinced themselves that a horrific act was actually one of mercy and faith. The prosecutor, a young attorney named Harold Mitchell, struggled with how to approach the case. The law was clear. James and Sarah Brennan had intended to murder their 4 children. The fact that they were stopped before completing the act was irrelevant to the charge. Intent was what mattered. But public sentiment was divided. Some demanded the harshest punishment, execution, for the parents who would have executed their own children. Others saw tragedy compounded by tragedy, and asked what purpose would be served by punishing 2 people who were already punishing themselves more severely than any court could. The trial took place in early December of 1930. The courthouse was packed. People stood in the aisles. Others crowded outside, waiting for news. The Brennan children were not present. They'd been placed in temporary care with a church family, and everyone agreed they should be spared further trauma. James and Sarah pleaded guilty to 4 counts of attempted murder. There was no point in denying it. Reverend McKay had witnessed their intent, the physical evidence. The pyre built in their cabin, the rope, spoke for itself. The question was sentencing. Their defense attorney, a pro bono lawyer named Samuel Webster, argued for leniency. He called witnesses who testified to the family's poverty. The storekeeper who'd extended credit until he couldn't anymore. The mine supervisor who'd laid off James with genuine regret. Neighbors who described hearing the children crying from hunger. A doctor who examined James and Sarah and confirmed they were both suffering from malnutrition. These people were starving, Webster told the jury. Not metaphorically, not exaggerating, genuinely starving. Their children were dying slowly, painfully, and they knew it. In their desperation and hunger, they convinced themselves, wrongly, horribly, wrongly, that they could spare their children suffering by hastening their death and delivering them to God's care. He paused, letting that sink in. They were wrong, absolutely, unquestionably wrong, but this is not a case of malice. This is a case of a society that failed its most vulnerable members so completely that they broke under strain. Prosecutor Mitchell presented a different argument. We cannot excuse attempted murder because of poverty. If we do, where does it end? How many desperate parents might decide that killing their children is an act of mercy? The law exists to protect the innocent. These 4 children were innocent. They had no voice in this decision. They deserved protection, from others, and from their own parents. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was heavy. On all counts, we find the defendants guilty. Sarah closed her eyes. James didn't react at all. However, the foreman continued, we recommend mercy in sentencing. Judge Harlan Freeman, no relation to the county, was a man in his 60s who'd presided over countless cases. He'd sentenced murderers to hang. He'd sent thieves to prison. He'd dealt with domestic violence and assault, and every manner of human failing. But this case troubled him deeply. At sentencing, 2 weeks later, he spoke for nearly half an hour. He talked about the Depression's toll, about how prosperity had failed to appear around any corner, about the thousands of families teetering on the edge, about the failure of government, of churches, of communities to provide adequate support. Then he addressed James and Sarah directly. "What you intended to do was an abomination. There is no circumstance, none, that justifies the killing of children, especially by their own parents. You were entrusted with their care, their protection, their nurturing. You violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible." Sarah was weeping silently. James stared at the floor. However, Judge Freeman continued, "I must balance justice with mercy. I must consider not only what you intended, but what circumstances brought you to that intention. This court finds that you were both suffering from temporary insanity brought on by extreme deprivation. You were not in your right minds. You convinced each other, through a shared delusion, that an act of horror was somehow an act of faith." He paused. "Therefore, I sentence you each to 10 years in the state psychiatric hospital. You will receive treatment for malnutrition, for the psychological trauma you've endured, and for the delusions that nearly caused you to destroy your family. Your children will be placed in foster care. Whether you will be reunited with them after your treatment is complete will depend on many factors, to be determined later." It was a compromise sentence that satisfied no one. The vengeful thought it too lenient. The compassionate thought it too harsh. But it was the sentence, and it stood. The years that followed were difficult for everyone involved. The Brennan children were split up, initially placed with different families who could care for them. Martha and Thomas went to a farm family in the next county. The twins were taken in by a couple who'd lost their own children to influenza. The children adjusted slowly. Martha had nightmares for years. Thomas developed a stutter that took months of patient work to overcome. The twins, young enough that their memories were mercifully hazy, recovered most completely, though Rebecca's cough never entirely disappeared. James and Sarah spent their decade in the hospital in separate wards. The treatment was primitive by modern standards, a combination of rest, nutrition, labor therapy, and religious counseling. Both of them struggled with guilt, so profound it manifested as physical illness. James developed stomach ulcers. Sarah's hair went entirely white within a year, but slowly, very slowly, they healed, or perhaps healed is the wrong word. They survived. They learned to live with what they'd intended to do. They came to understand, truly understand, how their desperation and hunger had warped their perception of reality and faith. Reverend McKay visited them monthly throughout their confinement. At first, they refused to see him, ashamed of what he'd witnessed. But he persisted, and eventually they talked. Long conversations about faith, about God's true nature, about the difference between testing and temptation, about how suffering can break the mind as surely as it breaks the body. "God didn't send you that dream," Reverend McKay told Sarah during one visit. "Your own fear sent it. Your love for your children, twisted by starvation into something unrecognizable. The devil doesn't always appear as a serpent. Sometimes he appears as an angel of light, telling us that evil is actually good." The Depression slowly eased. The New Deal programs brought relief to rural areas. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men in the mountains. Rural electrification projects strung power lines to remote hollows. It was too late for the Brennans, but it saved countless other families from reaching that same point of desperation. James and Sarah were released in 1940, too. America was now at war with Germany and Japan. The economic devastation of a decade earlier seemed almost quaint compared to the global conflict. They emerged into a different world, one that had remembered how to hope. They were not reunited with their children, The court determined it was in the children's best interest to remain with their foster families. Martha was now 21, married to a soldier who'd be shipping out to Europe within months. Thomas was 19, working at a factory that produced ammunition. The twins were 15, thriving in school, planning for futures that once had seemed impossible. There was one meeting, arranged carefully and supervised. The children, no longer children, really sat on one side of a church fellowship hall. James and Sarah sat on the other. Everyone cried, some things were said, some things remained unspoken. Martha, always the brave one, crossed the room. She looked at her parents aged far beyond their years, bent by guilt and time. "I forgive you," she said simply. "I don't understand what happened. Maybe I never will, but I forgive you." It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't restoration, but it was something, a small mercy in a story full of horror. James and Sarah lived quietly after that. They found work, him as a janitor at a school, her as a laundress at a hospital. They attended church, though they sat in the back and never spoke of their past. They grew old separately from their children, but received occasional letters, brief updates, careful acknowledgments that they still existed. James died in 1950, 8 of lung disease, his coal mine years finally catching up with him. Sarah lived until 1967. Neither lived to see grandchildren, though they knew they had several. The hollow where their cabin once stood grew over. Nature reclaimed the space, covering the foundation stones with moss and ferns. The creek still runs there, cold and clear, unchanged by human tragedy. On certain mornings when mist fills the valley, you can still make out the outline of where the cabin stood. But nobody builds there. Nobody ever has. The story of the Brennan family remains a disturbing reminder that desperation can't twist even the most fundamental human instinct, the drive to protect one's children, into something monstrous. It reminds us that faith without reason can become delusion, that suffering can break the mind as surely as the body, that good people, pushed beyond endurance, are capable of contemplating evil. But questions remain. Would James and Sarah have actually followed through? If Reverend Mackay had arrived 5 minutes later, would 4 children have died in that fire? Or would parental instinct have overridden religious delusion at the last moment? We'll never know, and perhaps that's for the best. What we do know is that the Great Depression created thousands of tragedies. Most didn't involve attempted murder. Most were quieter. Children sent away to orphanages, families broken by unemployment and shame, dreams deferred and then forgotten. But all of them, in their own way, were evidence of a system that had failed. To this day, in Harlan County, old-timers speak of the Brennan matter in hushed tones. It's a cautionary tale parents tell, though they rarely explain the details. Remember the Brennans, they say. Remember what desperation can do. And on cold November mornings, when frost covers the ground and smoke rises from chimneys throughout the hollows, people still report hearing children's voices carried on the wind. Laughter, they say, the sound of children playing, forever young, forever safe, forever removed from the harm that almost found them. The Brennan children lived full lives. Martha raised 3 sons. Thomas became a teacher. Jacob worked for the Postal Service. Rebecca married a doctor and moved to Lexington. They rarely spoke of what nearly happened that Sunday morning in 1930, too. Some traumas are too deep for words, but each of them, in their own way, lived lives dedicated to helping others. Martha volunteered at soup kitchens. Thomas taught in the poorest schools he could find. Jacob helped rural families get mail, order goods they couldn't otherwise afford. Rebecca opened a free clinic for miners and their families. They'd seen the depths of human desperation. They'd felt its effects in their own small bodies, and they dedicated their lives to ensuring no other family reached that same breaking point. Perhaps that's the only redemption possible in a story this dark. Not that James and Sarah found peace, they never fully did, but that their children, who should have died that morning, instead lived lives of purpose and compassion. That trauma was transformed, over time and through great effort, into something approximating grace. If this journey through one of the darkest moments in Appalachian history resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the fine line between faith and delusion, between desperation and evil, between tragedy and justice, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with honesty and compassion. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on where responsibility lies when poverty drives people to the brink of madness. How do we balance punishment with compassion? How do we prevent such tragedies without excusing them? These are questions without easy answers. But they're questions we must continue to ask if we hope to understand the full complexity of the human condition, its capacity for both terrible acts and redemptive grace. Until next time, remember that history's darkest moments have lessons for us all. The Brennan family's story is extreme, but the poverty and desperation that drove them to the edge are not unique to their time or place. Wherever inequality and suffering exist unchecked, tragedy waits. This has been the Untold Hour.